Glenmorangie, the original, aged 10 years. At one time, this was actually my favourite whisky. Above all others, my favourite single malt Scotch whisky in the world. To be fair, at the time I hadn't had too many other quality whiskies, and amongst the other fairly mundane offerings that I had, this stood out as much more well made, because it was. But over time I kind of found more intense and more flavoursome whiskies and different styles of whisky, and I haven't really paid Glenmorangie that much attention since those days. So it will be interesting to revisit this one. Some of you may be surprised because I said that I was going to do a review of this and a comparison of these two, because this one has recently replaced this. Some of you may be surprised to see this old packaging because the 10 was rebranded to look more like this before they changed it from a 10 to a 12-year-old. And you might be wondering, how long have I had this one? Is it really old stock? Has it been on my shelf for 10 years? It actually hasn't. Time absolutely does fly, but the rebrand that Glenmorangie did to change what looked like this to a 10-year-old that looked more like this, it was actually less than 2 years ago. The 10 hadn't looked like this for very long at all before they changed it to the 12 that we've just got. And I actually bought this one probably no more than 6 months before they did that rebrand, so this is less than 2.5 years old, despite the fact that the look of this one might be a little bit unfamiliar to some of you. And while we're talking about the packaging for this one, it's interesting to have a look at all of the things that they tell us on the box of this, because there is quite a lot of information there. I've shown you a close-up of the front, I'll show you the back as well. And Glenmorangie have always been a proponent of waffling on about still size and still shape. You can see it there. Casks used only twice, apparently. And also a lot of mention of the 16 Men of Tain there, which is talking about the people that work at the distillery. I haven't actually seen any mention of the 16 Men of Tain recently on the rebranded packaging. I don't know if that's because they're not men anymore. Are they the 16 whisky people of Tain? Or is it because Glenmorangie has expanded a little bit and it's no longer possible to have it all done by 16 people? I don't know. But it is interesting when you look at some older packagings of Glenmorangie that they did make a big deal that there were only 16 people working there, and they kind of used that as an example of how it was supposedly a small-scale distillery, which is not really. Going back to the stills though, you can see from the little drawing that I just showed you that apparently the stills are 8 meters tall. So they are pretty tall stills, and they're quite narrow. Is narrow the word? They don't taper. They're quite, and Glenmorangie and a lot of other distilleries kind of 15-20 years ago, there was a lot of marketing involved in everyone was saying how their stills were the most unique and the best, and you could only get their unique whiskey out of their unique stills. You don't tend to hear that much about stills anymore. People tend to waffle on about cask finishes and terroir and various other marketing nonsense now. But yeah, interesting to see that it's not just whiskey that changes, but marketing trends change as well. But yeah, some of the tallest stills in Scotland, which it is said gives Glenmorangie a particularly light style, a light flavour profile. So this bottle here, you can see that the bottle shape is kind of as per the rebrand, but the label is 2 rebrands before that. Obviously, when I first bought my first bottle of this stuff, the label didn't even look like this. I think it's probably a couple of rebrands before this when I first started drinking this stuff. But yeah, this is the 10-year-old that I've got. As I said, it's probably about 2.5 years old, and as you can see, I haven't actually got very much of it left. So I'm going to have to stretch that out to get through this review and the comparison. It's also worth mentioning that as well as being light in style because of those tall stills, it's also light on alcohol because this is, as with all all of the entry-level Glenmorangies here in the UK, it's bottled at a flat 40%, maybe 43 elsewhere in the world, but here where it's made, we only get the 40% weak stuff. Is it artificially coloured and chill filtered? I don't know. It doesn't say. Probably. What am I basing that on? Not a lot really, other than that in my opinion when a distillery chooses to bottle at the minimum strength of 40%, I think that alone is enough for us to be wary and cautious of their presentations unless they're going to give us that guarantee. I think that when a distillery chooses to bottle at 40%, that in itself should tell you that you can't really trust too much in their commitment to quality and presentation. What was that? Let's get some in the glass. But not too much because I'm running out. I did absolutely used to love this stuff though. Seems a lifetime ago now, and to be fair, it probably was. Probably was about 20 years ago. But I used to be a self-confessed Glenmorangie man. On the nose. I think it's a little bit more refined. I'm going to try not to go too much into comparison with this one, so I'll do a separate video comparing these two. But I think this one is a little bit more refined, a little bit more subtle, delicate, and I think it's more on ripe apples rather than citrus and orange. Apple and light vanilla, sweet with a little bit of spice on the nose. Pure refined barley sugar. It has also got that slight mineral barley note that I had on the 12, but probably not as much. I think that it's a more delicate style. Very light, very spirit driven, very pure and slightly simple. Really is all orchard fruits, maltiness, sweet, vanilla, apple, sugary. And that's probably about all I'm getting, but that's enough. I think it's a very pleasant style of whiskey. Let's see how it tastes. I would say that definitely looks chill filtered, but it probably looks more natural than the new 12. Now, I'm not going to make any guesses as to whether either of these are natural presentations, but I would say that from the taste of it, it probably tells you that there is more straightforward bourbon and refill bourbon in this, and I think there's probably a little bit of jiggery pokery going on in the new 12. On the palate of this one, again, sweet and delicate, sweet green apples, a little bit of banana and more of that sweet vanilla profile, a little bit of a slight cardboardiness. I do think that this is probably not quite as mature, not as well matured as Glenmorangie was when I first started drinking it. I do think that it's slightly youthful, although not to a problematic extent, with a slight bitter grassy quality. And again, as per the nose, the palate on this one is fairly simple, but I think that that's not necessarily a bad thing. This is a style of whiskey that I enjoy going back to. I think that it would make a great guard whiskey or a palate calibrator or a warm-up dram, or just a dram for sharing with people who aren't into their more extreme whiskies too. I think that this has a lot of places and uses, and it has a lot going for it. I think that it's pure whiskey that really straddles the line between quality single malt and quality new make, because it really strips back all of those distractions that a lot of us have become very accustomed to in modern whiskey. It is a pure malt experience. Let's have one more sip and look at the finish. Sweet and malty, evidence of those bourbon casks, but really it's a background note. Slightly young, short length and mild. So at the start of this video, when I said that this stuff, or a couple of rebrands before this, used to be my favourite whiskey of all time, all those years ago, how many of you laughed or thought, wow, that's naive? Because I probably would have done as well. I think that anyone that says that Glenmorangie is their favourite whisky, especially the Glenmorangie 10, that whether it's fair or not, I think a lot of us like to think that that tells you something about the kind of whisky that that person likes. But I actually, tasting this again, I don't think that it's that silly to really fall in love with this kind of expression and this kind of whisky. I think that this is a very unadulterated style of whisky, and while I may be enjoying this in a slightly different way now, with a lot more years of experience, I still find myself enjoying this a lot. And interestingly, I think that I enjoy this in a few ways that are kind of missing from the newer rebranded products. I find this one interesting both for what is there and also for what's not there. In particular, I think that this one, it's nice to have a whisky which, aside from not being covered up by cask finishes and cask influences or peat or anything else, it's not even obscured by first fill bourbon. And sadly, I think that's actually becoming a more and more rare thing these days. It surprised me though. I didn't expect, going back to this, to love it. I expected this to be a fairly negative review, and it's why I've put off doing this review for the last couple of years, because I didn't expect to like this, but I actually really do. It's almost pure barley malt spirit, and I think that that forces you to approach this whisky in a slightly different way. I think that some people will try this perhaps as a bar pour in a less informal setting and possibly miss that. I think that it would be easy to miss what's great about this and just be left with an underwhelming impression, but I think in that situation the blame would really be on us rather than the whisky. I think that this is a refreshingly simple dram, not over-blended or overburdened by cask influence, as many modern malts are. It is focused and refined and pure and stripped down, almost a minimalist whisky. If we're defining single malt whisky as distilled malted barley spirit, then this is an unmessed with and honest a whisky as you can find. And me personally, I think that's a really fun thing to explore. If anyone's considering trying to pick up an old bottle of this, or you can see an old dusty of this in a shop, I think, without giving too many spoilers about my comparison video that's coming up, I think this one is significantly different to this one, and I think that it's good in ways that this one's not. I think that this one has some other things to offer as well. But I think that if you're a Glenmorangie fan and you have the opportunity to pick up a bottle of this for about the retail price that this sells for, then this is well worth a purchase. So thanks for joining me today, and I will see you shortly on the comparison video of Glenmorangie 10 and 12, where I'll go over those differences a little bit more. Until then, thanks for watching, and cheers.